power in the back. In the back on the bottom, there's a power switch.
All right. I think we've got just about everyone here. I want to welcome you all to our, our fifth senior presentation. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Annika Urness, who I'm sure you'll see that name again on some ballot in the future. I'm sure of it, somewhere, some way. And while I have not known Annika very long, I'm sure that all of you could agree that you don't need to know Annika very long to know that she is very passionate about social justice issues. And so I'd like you to put your hands together and welcome Annika.
Hello. For my senior capstone project, I studied the way in which the presence of intersectional feminism, lack of intersectional feminism, or somewhere in between, has affected the dynamics of female success and unity through American history and modern day in the House of Representatives. Before we move forward, I have a few concepts to define. I already said intersectional feminism twice, and I want to give you definitions because my project is largely based on the understanding of these things. Intersectionality is the understanding of how different identities compound to affect privilege and discrimination. Intersectional feminism is feminism, the belief that one gender is not inherently better than another, centering marginalized women who are affected by not only sexism, but also racism, transphobia, ableism, or other societal prejudices. White feminism is feminism that consciously or unconsciously centers white women and assumes certain experiences unique to white women are universal. I want to clarify that these concepts are not mutually exclusive. External factors affect any given individual's perception of feminism and equality, and intersectionality is a spectrum. It isn't just there or not there. Through this project, I explored historical and modern events and concepts through the lens of intersectional feminism as a social and structural phenomenon. In examining the women's suffrage movement, we can apply the idea of intersectionality retroactively. These ideas and dynamics weren't talked about with the language we have now, but we can use those concepts to describe and understand these historical events. I chose to focus on the women's suffrage movement because of its interactions with Reconstruction-era abolitionism, which led to the passage of the 15th Amendment, giving Black men the right to vote. The women's suffrage movement led to the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So there are clear, measurable results of both of these movements. At first, there were a lot of overlap between them. They initially were unified and working towards one unified equal rights amendment. When the 15th Amendment passed, suffragist leaders Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were disappointed by the bill's exclusion of women's rights and felt betrayed by abolitionists like Frederick Douglass's support of the amendment. In turn, they focused their attention solely on advancing the rights of women. And in the wake of Jim Crow and voter suppression laws, the women's suffrage movement became much more segregated. White suffragists alienated Black suffragists by focusing their image on being middle class, educated, and white. This is an example of white women using the privileges of being white to separate themselves from Black women. An example of white feminism, while advancing the rights of white women, the 19th Amendment was passed, and it did give white women the right to vote, but harming women of color. Women of color were not allowed unencumbered access to the vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prevented all racist practices such as literacy tests and poll taxes. This time gap between the achievements of white women and achievements of Black women has continued into the modern day. The first woman elected to the House of Representatives, Jeannette Rankin, was elected before women had the right to vote nationally. The first woman of color to be elected to the House, Shirley Chisholm, wasn't elected until 1968. In history, as white women separated themselves from Black women, so might they separate themselves from other white women, relating themselves to men in hopes of success despite their gender. In the present day and through history, women in male-dominated fields, may find support of their experiences and their careers in groups of other like-minded women. Brooke Baldwin defines this concept as a huddle. A huddle is a moment that brings women together in any time or place, whether on the front lines of a public protest or in a quiet church basement, to provide each other with support, empowerment, inspiration, and the strength to solve problems or enact meaningful change. The Squad is a group of 4 female representatives of color and a modern example of a huddle. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib, whether or not they're personal friends, support each other and come from a place of shared experiences and community to further their collective power. A larger scale example of a female community in the House of Representatives is the Democratic Women's Caucus, a group of Democratic women who often collaborate on policy. One notable example of unity between them was during former President Trump's State of the Union address in 2020, where they wore white to pay homage to women suffragists, a tradition which has continued in many politically prominent women. A vital presence to the dynamic of female unity in the House of Representatives is the current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Speaker Pelosi was the first woman ever elected Speaker of the House, and she was the most politically prominent woman in America until the election of Vice President Kamala Harris. Nancy Pelosi often emphasizes unity, despite some of her own actions. In 2019, Pelosi was criticized for voting in favor of a bill that increased funding of then-President Trump's immigration authorities, conceding to then-Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. After facing opposition by Representatives Omar and Ocasio-Cortez, Speaker Pelosi expressed her frustration with the representatives voting against quote-unquote our bill. Nancy Pelosi is an example of a white feminist, participating in and leading superficial gestures in the name of intersectionality, but focusing her actions on benefiting white women. She mirrors history by marketing herself to Republicans and white men, showing she is capable of holding moderate views and finding common ground, and separating herself from her Democratic colleagues of color whose actions she finds too extreme, to keep her marketability as universal as possible. While this strategy may further her own career, it does not endear her to or connect her with voters or her colleagues. Moving into the future of politics, we must emphasize community over competition and connect voters and representatives who reflect the full spectrum of our country. Speaking of community, we're now going to see how the Valley New School Friends community thinks. With the people represented in this group, are we unified? Do we represent a full spectrum of opinions? In a moment, I'm going to invite you to actually stand up and move into the hall. There are signs on the ground that say agree and disagree. You're going to stand behind them, facing the entrance to the building for kids. Once we're all out there, I'm going to make 3 statements, and you'll move to one side of the hall or the other, depending on how much you agree or disagree with that statement. This is kind of like the traffic cone activity we did in the beginning of the year, for those of you who were there. When everyone has moved, you can raise your hand if you would like to share the reason behind your position in the room. And just a reminder to be respectful, please, of everyone's opinions. This is for fun, and just out of polite curiosity. Move now. where we would like to be? Okay, does anyone want to share the reason behind their position briefly? If no, we will move on. All right, statement number 2. Politics are not important to me. Politics are not important to me. Are we all where we would like to be? Cool. Look around a little bit. If anyone would like to share the reason behind their position in the room, you can raise your hand. Yeah, Trent.
Because whether or not active policy making makes a difference, it's still affecting whether or not we or other people works.
For sure. Does anyone else want to bring their position in the room? Now we will move on to statement number 3. Everything is political. Everything is political. Are we all? Are we all where we would like to be? Yes. Good. All right. Would anyone like to share their position? And now? Yeah, Tim.
Whether or not I'd like things to be political, the unfortunate truth is that just about everything is made political by the press or by the law.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, Tim.
I believe that some things are political, but I wouldn't say everything is political. I think choices can be impacted by political decisions, but not everything is inherently.
Yeah, go ahead. So far. Statement number 2, politics are not important to me. I disagree with this statement. I believe that separation of policy and life is dependent on how much of your life is dependent on policy. And statement number 3, everything is political. I somewhat agree with this statement. I think everything can have policy applied to it. Excellent. Thank you for participating and sharing your answers, and we'll head back inside now. So for my non-written product, I created a Google site as if I was the representative for our district, which is the 8th district of Wisconsin. Here you can see my homepage, and here is a link to Dome Watch, which is a site that shows you voting schedules and live updates on the House of Representatives. This week is actually a voting week in the House, so you can see the full schedule of the bills being voted on and where the House is, and a live stream of the House proceedings. So that's a really incredible website. Here is my issues page. I have created this pretend campaign that focuses on intersectionality and community over competition. and emphasizes the importance of having legislators who serve the people, not who are served by the people. Here is my contact page. These are actually real offices. This is Mike Gallagher's office. He is the current representative for the 8th District of Wisconsin. And over here is Ron Johnson's office in DC. Ron Johnson is a Wisconsin senator along with Tammy Baldwin. So I put myself in their offices to kind of manifest the future of Wisconsin legislators. And this link down here takes you to Tammy Baldwin's email form. Here is my About Me page. I have a little blurb about my senior project, and then links to my senior essay and my logs. My notes for this project were kind of disorganized. I have notes on a bunch of different platforms and in a bunch of different places, but I ended up doing something to consolidate them and to connect my research phase with my production phase. So I wrote smaller essays about all my subtopics listed here. And I think this helped me to kind of process and synthesize my information. And it helped me when I was writing my essay because a year is a long time to be working on a project. So I could go back to my shorter essays and sort of refresh and remember the point of the subtopic in my larger essay. Here is how my research question has evolved through the year. History of women in politics is not a question, but it was my initial topic, and I quickly realized this was way too broad of a topic, especially without a specific question to guide my research. My second question was, how might we use the evolution of public view of female politicians to identify how they interact with discrimination in the House of Representatives? This focused more on the public and media view of female politicians and how they're scrutinized by the media more than male politicians and how they have to market themselves around being women in order to be seen as professional and to be seen as leaders. My third research question was, how might we use the unification of women in male-dominated fields to describe instances of unity of women in the House of Representatives? This was more focused specifically on applying the huddle theory retroactively through the history of the House and through the history of America. And then from there, I have my final research question: how does the presence or lack thereof of intersectional feminism in politics affect unity of women in the House of Representatives? I think this encapsulates kind of the point of my previous research questions, and this is most accurate to what I wanted to research and what I have researched throughout the year. My live sources were Lee Snodgrass, who is a member of the Wisconsin State Assembly, and Maggie Weiss, who is a senior and a government major at Lawrence University. Something really cool I got to do for this project, I got to go to Washington, D.C. with my dad in the spring, and I saw an exhibit about the women's suffrage movement called Rightfully Hers at the National Archives, which was incredible. And at the National African American History Museum, we saw this Lifting as We Climb banner made by Black suffragists, which was really impactful to see because when I interviewed my live source, Representative Lee Snodgrass, she mentioned having a shirt that says Lift as You Climb, which is kind of the whole thesis of what I was researching, like women making progress collectively instead of dismantling the proverbial ladder as soon as they climbed it. So that was a really incredible live experience. Next year, I will be attending Lawrence University to study government. In 10 years, I hope to be living my best, meticulously scheduled life as a wildly successful lawyer or politician with my very rich spouse in Washington, D.C. Thank you to my friends, my family, my advisor, my live sources, Red, White, Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and Reputation by Taylor Swift. Thank you, and I'm ready to take any questions you have.
What is your advice for future seniors?
Question was, what is my advice for future seniors? Something that helped me a lot during my project was meeting with my live source, Maggie Weiss. She helped me a lot with the production of my essay because I was able to not only talk about the structure of my essay, but also kind of talk on a high level about the content of my essay. So I don't know if that's like universally applicable advice, but I think like regularly meeting with a live source is very helpful. Yeah, Peter.
Throughout this project or throughout your research, have your like views on this topic changed?
Question was, throughout my research or throughout this project, have my views on my topic changed? This is a really good question. I definitely, like, this project is definitely really dependent on my personal views. And I think my views and my lens didn't really change, but I definitely have a more full understanding of my topic and of, you know, like all of the sides of the political spectrum, if that makes sense. Yeah, Liz.
What has your favorite part of the project process been, and did that change for your senior project?
My favorite parts of the project process are probably production or speech night, and those are definitely still my favorites. I love speech night so much, and I really enjoyed writing my essay, and I also really enjoyed finishing my essay. So, yeah. Yeah, Trin.
What would you like policy to look like in 10 years, and how do you realistically think it will look in 10 years?
Oh, good question. How would I like policy to look in 10 years, and how do I realistically think it will look in 10 years? Obviously, I would like it to look different than it does now, especially some of the recent bills that have been passed in certain states. And I think how it realistically will look is very dependent on the legislators we elect in the next 10 years, which is very dependent on who votes in the next 10 years. So, you know, register to vote in the next 10 years. Yeah, good question. Yes, Owen Garvey.
Favorite politician of all time?
Favorite politician of all times. I kind of dislike politicians, all of them inherently, because, you know, but I do really respect the work that Tammy Baldwin does, and I really respect the work that AOC does. I have a poster on my desk. Yeah, Mr. Filkey.
When we vote, are we electing a person and their policies and their ideals, or are we voting for someone to represent us as constituents? And like, how do you see that difference?
I think that definitely depends on like your personal views. Sorry, I'll repeat the question. When we elect a representative, are we electing a person with their views and their policies, or are we electing someone who represents us? And again, I think that depends on, you know, your personal opinion. I think that we are electing someone, like, for both of those reasons. You know, I think there are a lot of factors that goes into who you choose to vote for, including, you know, their policies, their previous actions, their, you know, party labels, and, you know, what you think they will do to improve your lives. So I think there are a lot of factors that go into electing someone. Yeah, Karina.
What was some of the best advice that you received throughout the course of this project?
What was some of the best advice that I received throughout this project? That is a hard one. I think some of the best advice is very similar to what Lydia said, which was like one shovel at a time. Like every step you make towards completing your project is, you know, one step closer to completing your project, which is really helpful advice, and, you know, is bracing, you know. So I appreciated that. Yeah, Karina again.
How did you motivate yourself?
How did I motivate myself? I think the trip to Washington, D.C. definitely like gave me a kick of motivation. And besides that, like thinking about finishing the project and like how I'm gonna feel when the project is done, and like where I'm gonna be when the project is done is like very motivating, I think. Yeah.
How did you take notes?
Why did I take notes?
How?
Oh, how did I take notes? I took notes by, first of all, I took a lot of notes on Google Docs, by just like, you know, so you can have your source right there. You can actually cite sources on Google Docs, which is really cool. I didn't know that. So you can have the source right there, and then like, you know, you can take passages from the source, you can whatever, and then you can add opinions and comments and things. So I did those. I took some paper notes, and then I created the essays with those. Yeah, Sage.
Would you have done anything differently with your project process or for your project?
Would I have done anything differently with my project process or for my project? Yeah. Yeah, Ms. B.
Do you take any notes or do research on primary sources or policy itself? And how was that experience, if so?
Good question. Did I take any notes on primary sources or policy itself, and how was that? I did. I would watch like AOC's live streams. Sometimes I went in and I like read bills sometimes that are passing through the House, because you can see them on Dome Watch. It's a great website, and it's useful, I think, to see the actual words of the legislature that's passing, because there's a lot of commentary on the legislature and a lot of like, you know, biased reporting on the legislature that is passing and, you know, going through our Congress right now. So I think it is valuable to actually look at the bills and look at the policy and look at, you know, policy that has passed through history, and, you know, see maybe how it was intended and see it without any outward commentary. Yeah, Shane.
Why do you think people in places of privilege should vote and be progressive in politics?
Why do I think people in power?
People in places of privilege, people with steady lives who aren't going to be that effective overall.
Okay. Why do I think people in places of privilege should still vote and still contribute to our democracy and be progressive in politics? I don't think anyone should vote in any particular way. You know, I'm not trying to influence you, the audience, to like vote in a specific way, even though I'm sharing a lot of personal opinions in this project. But I think that people in places of privilege still, have an interest in the country they live in, and still, should be interested in improving that country so others can have the experience that they have had living in the country and experiencing life the way they do. Yeah, Mr. DeMay.
Can you expand on one of the pieces you said with your website where you talked about the representative should serve the people and not the people serving the representative? What did you mean by it?
Yeah, totally. The question was, can I expand on the part of my research product where I talk about how legislators should be served, or should serve the people and not be served by the people? I think a lot of our current representatives who have been in Congress a long time, they're career politicians, because politicians get paid a lot of money. And there are a lot of politicians who run and who are elected and who do the job for the money. And that is kind of the thing that I'm opposed to, because they don't have necessarily the best interests of the people in mind. They don't have the perspective of the average American citizen in mind. They're just, thinking about what policies are the most profitable and what policies will keep them in office. So I'm looking for more representatives who have a wider range of experiences and a wider range of maybe careers before and after politics. Does that answer your question? Yeah, Karina.
what was something that went well in this project, and what was something that was challenging?
What was something that went well with this project? Every senior says this, it's very hard not to hit dead spots or like, you know, slow down over the course of the project in that like, you know, winter purgatory kind of place where you're like kind of in research and kind of looking at planning. So I think that is something that was challenging. Yeah.
How did you balance your other year-long projects as well as your senior project, and did you have any trouble doing that?
How did I balance my senior project with my year-long projects, and did I ever have trouble doing that? I think something that helped me balance my year-long project and my senior project was a lot of my year-long things are scheduled. Like we have math every day from 9 to 10. We have literature every day from 12:30 to 1:30. I do French on Mondays and Thursdays. And I think that kind of like regularity helped me balance my time in between. Yeah, Veronica.
How are your two live sources like different from each other? Like what did you gain from each one?
Oh, cool. How are my two live sources different from each other, and what did I gain from each one? Representative Lee Snodgrass is like a real woman in politics, and she's actually been through the process of running and being elected, and she is has the experience of serving as a politician. So it was really cool to hear her opinions and her experiences as someone who's currently in politics. And Maggie Weiss is in a position that is very similar to where I could be in 4 years. So it was really cool to talk to her and kind of see where I could be and get advice from her as having done something that I plan to do. She went to Lawrence and she's doing a governance major. So that was really cool to hear her experience. Yeah, Reader.
Are you glad your senior project is basically over, or are you disappointed?
The question was, am I glad my senior project is over, or am I disappointed? I am so glad. I'm so glad it's over. It's not quite over. I still have to assess and everything. But I am so glad. I think this experience was so valuable, and I am glad to be completing it. Yeah, Lydia.
So I don't know if you already said this, but what is your opinion on people who have been in the same political House representatives or senator for 30, 40 years, like Nancy Pelosi, for example? She's been in there for 30 years now. What's your opinion on that?
Question was, what is my opinion on representatives who have been in the House or in the Senate for 30, 40 years, for a very long time? I do believe, completely my personal opinion, you are free to take this or leave this. I am a strong believer in term limits for the House and the Senate, which we do not currently have. I think we need, someone can only be president for 2 terms of 4 years, and I think we need term limits. Yeah, Tim.
What do you believe you specifically bring to the political conversation?
What do I believe I specifically bring to the political conversation? Obviously, no one has ever lived my particular life. And I think we have, first of all, a lot of younger voices in politics, and I believe we need more younger voices in politics because the representation in our Congress right now is significantly older than the majority of the population, and as someone who will be able to vote very soon, I am excited to add my voice to the political arena. Does that answer your question? Yeah, Sage.
Overall, biggest takeaway from this whole entire project for you?
Overall, biggest takeaway This whole project kind of like confirmed my hopes for my future, I think. You know, I got to Washington DC and I was like, yes, like, I'm gonna be here. This is great. So I think, you know, my biggest takeaway was confirmation that like this is what I want to do and this is what I want to work on. Yeah, Ms. D.
As a feminist, where do you feel progress stands right now for equal opportunity or rights? And what steps do you feel need to be taken?
Question was, as a feminist, where do I feel we stand right now with equal opportunity and what steps do I think need to be taken in the future? I think we have come a long way since, you know, like the passage of the 19th Amendment. But I think right now, a lot of things that have been established previously are coming into question more and are being second guessed, which is precarious in my opinion. And I believe we need to solidify our basic rights in order to move forward. Is that yeah, Ms. Lum.
You mentioned in talking about your project process that you blended the research and production phase and how those kind of interchanged a bit. Can you explain what the benefits and or the pitfalls of that were?
Yeah, the question was, I talked about blending my research phase and my production phase and what were the benefits and like the challenges of that. I think that some of the benefits were like going back and kind of revisiting some of my research from the beginning of the year that I maybe, you know, like hadn't looked at in a while, and, you know, kind of going back through all of my sources regularly, so I was able to, you know, like, be prepared to write my paper, I guess. And also, so the project feels more like all of my research is kind of building into my paper instead of like, you know, I'm doing this research and then like writing this paper, if that makes sense. And then challenges were definitely, you know, like organizing the notes, I think, and like recording progressively kind of my research, I guess. Yeah.
Do you believe it is more valuable to have experience than to have new ideas in policy?
Do I believe it is more valuable to have experience or to have new ideas in policy? I think like a mix of these two, ideally. And I don't think one is beneficial without the other. Mr. May.
So you spent time with the history of feminism, women's suffrage and things like that. What are some things that stood out to you that this audience should know that maybe you don't necessarily hear a lot about in the history of women's suffrage?
Mr. May said, I spent a lot of time with like the history of women's rights and women's suffrage. What is something that like people don't talk enough about the history of women's suffrage that I think people should know? I think, you know, definitely like the women's suffrage movement thing was a big thing that I like, you know, did a lot of research about, and I was like, oh my God, like I had no idea that this was going on and these dynamics were happening. So that's kind of like a big one that I wanted to include. And I think the whole huddle theory is really cool, and something that there's a book I read called Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall, which talked about how women of color have historically been more unified, like you know, have been more like had more community than white women, because of how I talked about white women can like, you know, relate ourselves to white men because we have the white privilege in common. And I thought that was like really interesting. And so when the women's, like the Me Too movement of 2016 and the kind of like solidarity and sisterhood movements were kind of being introduced as like a new concept, it's not a new concept, basically. I don't know if that was